Yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Nimesh. So I'm Bhashwati and chairing this session on migration and refugee. And let me begin by congratulating NICE for organizing this, very interesting event spread over 3 days, and inviting me to chair this session. I think all present here would agree that in today's world, globalized world, migration and refugee, these two, terms and concepts we are hearing all the time. It's extremely important. And it can be looked at from various perspectives. So I think it's very, I think it would be very fruitful to have a session on migration and refugee that you have, put in this whole convention. If we look at migration per se, we can always say that human mobility has been part of human existence. So people have moved from one place to the other, either for seeking opportunity, or they have been basically fleeing violence and persecution. So if you look at the story of human life, mobility has been very much a part of it. But if you look at it today in a globalized context, I think it's qualitatively different in terms of what mobility means and the kind of both the challenges and the opportunities that it poses. And that is why I think it becomes, as I said, qualitatively different when we are talking about migration and refugee in a globalized world. And what we have been increasingly witnessing is, on the one hand, there is a lot of opportunity, but also there is increasing anxiety around globalization, around movement, around mobility. And in a globalized world, which is where interdependence, as we know, is increasing, and it's not going to sort of go away in the near future, it's only going to strengthen. But at the same time, it looks like the question of borders, states and borders, they're very much on the agenda. They remain there, and states strive to regulate those borders. And therefore, this whole question of how do we contextualize migration, how do we look at refugees, and I think extremely important, especially today when we are looking at what is unfolding in Afghanistan. If you look at the UN report on international migration of 2020, it shows that in the last 2 decades, international migration has really sort of increased in volume. So there's been a kind of very robust international migration that has been happening. And in 2020, which means last year that we are talking of when this report came up, 281 million people were basically international migrants, in the sense that they were not in in their countries of origin. So they were spread over various countries. And again, there are countries which are more, sort of either you could say welcoming, or are more attractive in terms of the opportunities they offer. So international migration has been increasing. As I said, 281 million is what the UN report says. And from this 281 million, 12% are refugees. And these 12%, again, if you look at the report, it shows that the number of people who are fleeing conflicts, violence, violation of human rights, that again has increased manyfold over these last 2 decades. For instance, the figures show that it was in the year 2000, people moving out, refugees, which means basically being pushed out from their countries where they of their origin, was 17 million, and in 2020 the number has gone up to 34 million. So we can see the kind of movement there is, and we can also see the kind of anxieties therefore that accompany that. And this was also very, very clear when we saw in 2015 Europe reeling under refugee crisis, what was, and I would say quote unquote refugee crisis, because the number of people who had actually moved into Europe was 1 million plus. So if you look at Europe per se in terms of population, maybe not a huge number, but we also saw that, again, the kind of anxieties, the discourse, the narrative around this, the people who were coming in, ranging from, that the sheer problem of accommodating so many people suddenly, that's a kind of a infrastructural problem which one can talk of. But at the same time, there was a narrative and discourse which was going on parallelly, that we don't want people, because you're basically looking at the refugees and the movement of the other in terms of the of the other. So this whole aspect of othering. So I won't take time on this. We can come back to all of this. We have a wonderful panel of 9 presentations. We have 9 presentations slated. So I think we can have 10 minutes each so that we have some time for discussion. And we can come back to many of these issues in terms of opportunities and challenges and the kind of narrative, as I said, which is basically a negative narrative, which is very much out there so far as movement of people is concerned. The first presenter is Vijeta Mahendru, and she's, I think, associated with NIES itself as a visiting scholar. And her paper is on, let me just check that out. Yes, her paper is on Sikh diaspora and homeland politics in the context of farmers' protest in India. Vijeta, over to you, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I'll straight away jump into the topic because of the shortage of time. So as we talk about migration, there's a lot of talk about economics of migration and about forced migration, etc. But there is slightly less attention about the identity issues that migrations also create. So my paper focuses on basically that. So, today identities are more fragmented in the world than ever before. Proliferation of means of transport and communication led to an unprecedented migration since the beginning of the last century, and it's ever rising. While the movement of populations is happening for a wide range of reasons, nation states of the day are having to face a typical problem: the decoupling of the territorial location of a person and their political membership. There is substantive research on how immigrant communities assert their political rights in the host countries. This is also one thing that, in the host country, their political participation, there is some research about it, but then this other side of it, the participation of immigrants in their home countries is not very well documented, as it is also a slightly newer phenomena. So Gabriel Schaeffer argues that the high correlation between immigrants' homeland politics and the level that there is a high level of correlation between immigrants' homeland politics and the level of integration of immigrants in their host country, which means as immigrants become more integrated in their host societies, their sense of confidence to participate in homeland countries politics also increases. So this paper discusses this issue in the light of the farmers' protest in India and the participation of the global Sikh community in it. So it has 3 parts actually. The first part lays down the theoretical argument about how concepts of nationhood and full citizenship are no longer bounded by geography, and the tidy conception of nation states as territorially bounded entities with fixed population of citizens has been permanently disrupted. At the same time, the significance of the space between people has been eclipsed by information and communication technology. So ICT is decisive when it comes to any form of political participation today, but when it comes to the global participation of diasporic communities, ICT is actually the protagonist. It has been seen to exponentially increase the access to information and create common fora to maintain significant interests in their home countries. In the second part of my paper, I discuss about how the evolution of the Sikh community, the religion, and the politics of Sikhs within the independent Indian country has created the context in which this entire protest has happened, and the way the forms and the kind of the representations, the manifestations of this protest have really links from the very origins of the religion itself. So I'm just going to skip this part because there's a lot more to discuss in the final section of my paper. So just going by, I'll just jump into the central discussion now, that the participation of Sikh diaspora in the farmers' protest in Delhi, basically their digital diaspora comes out with a combination of 3 important things: immigration, IT connectivity, and networking. According to Michael Laguerre, digital diaspora is an immigrant group or descendants of immigrant population that uses internet connectivity to participate in virtual network of contacts for a variety of social, political, religious, and communication purposes. And for that most part, they may and for the most part, they may concern their hostland, homeland, or both, including their trajectory abroad. So internet is the most powerful tool in today's world, and indeed it is used for the spread of misinformation, fake news, and propaganda. But it has given the global transnational Sikh community and their supporters a legitimate platform for forging solidarities, raising their voices, and sharing knowledge and techniques to make a greater impact in their cause. Through this event, Sikhs have become a truly global digital diaspora. Their socio-economic development in their host societies, coupled with developments in technology, have enabled them to become a force to be reckoned with. I've divided the participation of diasporic Sikhs in 5 categories, but it is important to note that internet forms a bedrock upon which all the other action is undertaken, no matter who's undertaking them. The persons in each category, along with their specific actions, have created a following and maintained sustained presence online through their social media posts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So the first type of participation is political. This type of participation is carried out by both Sikh and non-Sikh politicians who have sizable population of Sikhs in their constituency. Tanmanjeet Singh Desi, the first turbaned member of parliament from Slough in UK, has been very vocal throughout this period. He has made a number of statements in favor of the farmers and has also garnered support from over 100 members of parliament and political peers from cross-party affiliations, urging PM Boris Johnson to raise the matter with his Indian counterpart, PM Modi. In level 1 talks between the foreign secretaries, Dominic Raab raised the issue with his Indian counterpart, S. Jaishankar, as well. In Canada, Jagmeet Singh, Gurratan Singh, Harjeet Sajjan, and Sara Singh, all politicians have been very vocal in this case. In January this year, the Conservative MP Ramandeep Brar also visited the protest site despite India's stern objection. Non-Sikh politicians like Jack Harris and Brad Wiz have also raised concern over the matter on social media. While Wiz's constituency is in British Columbia, which has the highest concentration of Sikhs in Canada, Harris's constituency, Newfoundland and Labrador, have very little Sikh presence. So, in these countries, even members of parliament from very little Sikh presence have raised their voice in solidarity. So that is because of the voices raised by their peers from from constituencies which have higher Sikh population. So this is a case in point which shows that some politicians abroad, like celebrities, have spoken on the matter no matter, with no personal benefit accruing to them. Justin Trudeau, the Canadian PM, has also expressed his concern in favor of the right to peaceful protest by the farmers. Australian parliamentarians have spoken, as well as some from the United States have spoken in this matter. Then the second type of engagement has been academic. A large number of Sikh and other South Asian academicians, professors, and students abroad have consistently raised their voice in this matter. There have been protests in solidarity with the farmers in some foreign universities, including Oxford and UK. A large body of academic literature has come out during these months, which discuss various aspects of the farm laws and nature of mass mobilization, the importance of agriculture for Punjab, the impact of protests on the diaspora, and about the relation of Sikhs with the Indian state. Some notable names are Professor Preetham Singh from Oxford and Gurnam Singh from the University of Warwick. They have appeared in various platforms, both academic and non-academic, to share their understanding, and Professor Gurnam Singh worked with the Akal channel in the UK as well. In February, 400 academicians from India and abroad wrote a letter to the Indian government stating that the farm laws pose a major threat to farming communities all over India. So in these ways, they have been forging solidarities. And the third form of political participation has been through press and media. Sikhs understand the value of having a voice in mass media dissemination, as it was the prime tool used against them by the Indian state in 1984. Over decades in their new homes, Sikhs have made a strong foothold in social, political, and economic spheres. And now, in the words of an editor of the Sikh Press Association UK, they have started telling their own stories. Sikhs are currently operating a number of media channels, both in TV as well as through online platforms in almost every country of their residence. Through these, they have continuously busted propaganda and shown ground reports at the protest sites, shared stories of challenges faced by the protesters, and garnered support in favor of the farmers. Countless new media handles have come up in this period, which discuss and share news about the protests. The fourth type of participation is through civil society involvement. The civil society has participated in various ways through holding massive car and truck rallies like the one in California with 10,000 cars. Due to COVID restrictions, there was no gathering of people abroad. There were usually these big car rallies. They have held protests outside Indian embassies around the world. Some people have just stood by the roads with big posters informing passers-by about the protests and asking for a honk in support. Remember all this because it's happening in the shadow of COVID, and social distancing is crucial. So people have distributed physical as well as digital information material. In addition to people from different walks of life have contributed in their own way, like a group of 40 US lawyers of South Asian descent wrote to President Biden expressing concerns about the Indian state's tactics in the protest. Celebrities like Lily Singh have been using their position to stand for the farmers, and she famously turned up at the Grammys in a mask that said that I stand with farmers. Trevor Noah, the comedian, also explained the issue in his show. So basically, people from all walks of life, and not excluding meme makers, have been putting their minds to raise their voice in this issue and make it count. I don't know if you all know about this, but Rihanna also tweeted a news article about the protest saying that, why are we not talking about this? And it led to many others speaking about the human rights concerns in this matter. Sikhs from US also crowdfunded to advertise about the protest in the Super Bowl football championship. A large number of sports persons like Monty Singh Panesar has spoken in support as well.
You need to wrap it.
Just one last point, ma'am. Then there's the last point is that there has been direct action of the diasporic Sikhs as well. Hundreds of Sikhs from abroad have come to India to join the protests, and so many others who protest about abroad express their helplessness in doing so. People have just come down to the borders and staying there, doing seva and running camps and cooking. And one of the famous ones was an NBA player called Satnam Singh, whose family lives in Punjab. Khalsa Aid, the global aid agency, has been at the forefront in providing aid to the farmers. And similarly, there are many other people who have just turned up at the borders providing direct action. While Indian state has maintained that it is an internal matter, but and of course a lot of media has been against this entire situation. So I'll just conclude very quickly. I'm unable to go much into the details, but in a globalized world, there are several challenges faced by both the political establishments in terms of their community continuity and human society in terms of being constituted of persons with rights, cultural, religious, linguistic, political, and others. As we are experiencing, diversity in the world is increasing at an increasing rate, and current notions of nation states as territorially bounded, socially closed, and culturally integrated societies is simply not sustainable. I will leave this discussion here, as this issue, just like the idea of nation states, is discursive, and it's unlikely to lead to any solid conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijeta. I think I'm sure there would be a lot of questions around this because you brought up a lot of issues. But essentially, I think what the point which you are making is, if you're looking at a globalized world, the kind of connectivity which is there, which was not earlier. People were moving, as I said earlier also, but their connection with the whole country of origin used to be limited because of the sheer difficulty of connections. But now with this kind of a IT revolution, the interconnectedness has become much more, and therefore it's much easier to connect back home with people back home and represent interests. So that's something which is interesting, and I'm sure, as I said, there would be questions we can take up later. The next presentation is by Priya Natarajan, and she is going to present on immigration in Canada, impact of skilled migrants. Priya, over to you, 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity. So my paper is basically on immigration in Canada and what the impact has been of the low-skilled workers there and the high-skilled workers. So I'll just delve into it right now. I'll just set my timer as well. So immigration is not only a large and important part of Canadian society, but it is also the epitome that brings Canada and the third world into contact. Immigration has made Canada the nation it is today, and the one that is not only diverse, but welcoming to those in need. This has created many linkages in a global market that leads to the richness of their society. For the most part, Canada has remained persistent that immigrants and refugees are welcome. Despite this, immigration policies continue to trigger debate, from worries about lowering wages to straining Canada's social support system to terrorism. The concerns are numerous. The past 25 years have seen a more or less continuous deterioration in the economic outcomes for immigrants entering Canada. However, economic outcomes for second generation Canadians, that is, the children of immigrants, are said to be more positive. And despite the economic difficulties, after approximately 4 years in Canada, most immigrants remained positive regarding their immigration decision, citing freedom, safety, rights, security, and prospects for the future as the aspects they appreciate most in Canada. Data has also suggested that, by and large, Canadians continue to see immigration as an important part of the development of Canada and that they continue to support it. In many transatlantic countries, we find evidence of significant anti immigrant sentiment and opposition to multicultural policies directed at immigrants and settled minority groups. Whether among the general public, as measured in opinion polls and votes for far right parties, or articulated by elected leaders and other elites, such views are found across the political spectrum in Europe and the United States. Against this background, Canada is a striking outlier. Compared to the citizens of other developed immigrant receiving countries, Canadians are by far the most open to and optimistic about immigration. As striking, Canadian public opinion has been supportive of immigration for a long time, and support has been increasing over recent decades, where there has been a time of economic uncertainty and concerns over foreign terrorists. As such, it is not surprising that there is a considerable interest in how immigrants fare in the Canadian labor market, as well as the impact they have on the labor market and the economy in general. The main outcomes of interest include here are real GDP and GDP per capita and unemployment, aggregate demand, and especially for housing, investment, productivity, and government expenditures, taxes, and net government balances. With respect to the dimension of how immigrants themselves fare in the Canadian labor market, immigrants are also facing economically, assimilating problems or integrating into the Canadian labor market in the sense of catching up to the earnings of the domestic born workers who otherwise have similar wage of determining characteristics. Importantly, the problem is getting worse in the sense that assimilation is slower for the recent immigrants who may never expect to fully catch up to the earnings of the domestic born workers. The slow labor market assimilation and increasing poverty is a flashpoint that can ultimately disrupt social discontent. This is the case especially since immigrants have expressed concern that they have been attracted into Canada by an immigration policy that gives points for skills and education, but such credentials are often not recognized. The flashpoint of potential concerns on the part of immigration from their lack of economic assimilation may turn into an inferno if it were also accompanied by negative reactions on the part of domestic born Canadians if immigrants were harming the labor market for domestic born workers or on the economy in general. So I would just like to go into impact of immigration on domestic economy. In theory, immigration can have a complex impact on various dimensions of the domestic labor market, including wages, employment, labor force participation, and unemployment. The supply influx of immigrants can lower domestic wages as they compete with domestic workers for jobs. This effect is likely to be greatest for domestic workers who are close substitute for immigrants. As such, if the immigration is of low skilled workers, then the wages of low skilled domestic workers should fall, and the wages of higher skilled workers may rise if they are complements to the less skilled workers. If the immigration of high skilled workers, which is generally the case in Canada, and if their skills are recognized and utilized, then the wages of high skilled domestic workers should fall, and the wages of lower skilled workers may rise if they are complements to the more skilled workers. To the extent that new immigrants are potential substitute for immigrants who may come into the country earlier, then the wages of the earlier immigrants are more likely to fall. The effect on the employment of domestic born workers will follow the same pattern as that of wages. That is, domestic workers are more likely to be displaced if they are close substitutes for immigrants, while their employment may increase if they are complements. The magnitude of the employment adjustment will depend in part on the degree to which domestic wages are flexible. If they are inflexible, which is often the case in European labor markets, then the brunt of the adjustment will occur on employment. If wages are flexible, which is the case in most of North America, then the employment adjustments will be smaller. Adjustment may also occur in the form of labor force participation. Domestic workers who compete for jobs that immigrants would occupy may drop out of the labor force altogether if they feel their chances of obtaining a job are reduced. In contrast, some family members may also enter the labor force to sustain family income if they feel that the jobs of other members are in jeopardy. Immigration, however, can be associated with many other factors that can offset these generally potential negative effects. Because of their high skills due to the skill-based point system and the increased importance of provincial nominee programs in Canada, immigrants may break skill shortages. Unemployment is not affected. Why? Reflecting the fact that immigrants increase aggregate demands for goods and services, especially housing, and this roughly offsets any increase in unemployment as they enter the labor market and search for employment. The initial increase in aggregate demand comes mainly from housing and consumption. In later year, it also comes from an increase in non-residential and machinery and equipment investment, stimulated by various forces, the overall growth in the economy, the generation of new capital to work with the new immigrants, and the positive impact on corporate profits, which tend to expand in advance of the overall economy. Productivity of both domestic workers and new immigrants is increased because of the increase in investment relative to consumption and the fact that the average workers in the investment sector, which is residential and non-residential, are somewhat more productive than those in the consumer sector. This effect partly, but only partly, offsets the assumed lower productivity of new immigrant workers as they are not placed on job commensurate with their skills. Government's expenditures increase in response to new immigration, but the increase in expenditure is less than the increase in taxes paid by immigrants for various reasons. The taxes are more immediate while many of the expenditures come later. There are economies of scale in the provision of government services. Immigrants tend to enter into the tax-paying years later in their life cycle because tax paid by immigrants exceed expenditures. Immigration adds to overall government balances. This represents a significant reserve against future needs or could perhaps be deployed into additional social programs or tax cuts. I'll just like to go into the conclusion. Immigration is said to have a positive impact on the Canadian labor market and economy in general. This is the case with respect to such factors as real GDP and GDP per capita, aggregate demand, investment, productivity, and government expenditure, taxes, and especially net government balances, with essentially no impact on unemployment. The real concern, however, is with respect to immigrants themselves, in that they appear to be having an increasingly difficult time economically assimilating into the Canadian labor market, and new immigrants are increasingly falling into poverty. Furthermore, existing immigrants are likely to be adversely affected by expanding immigration since new and existing immigrants are likely substitutes. Improving the economic integration of immigrants into the Canadian economic market is likely to be beneficial not only for the immigrants themselves, but also because they have such integration is likely to enhance the general positive impact that immigrants have on the Canadian economy. In Canada, citizen support for immigration is widespread amongst all segments of the population, and remarkably, support has been increasing over the past decade. Despite significant inflows of new migrants, the global recession, and fears of foreign terrorists, among immigrants, identification with Canada is very high and echoes the majority support for such things as universal healthcare, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Canadian flag. The success of the Canadian model is due in part of the economic orientation of immigration policy. The vast majority of Canadians view immigrants as beneficial to Canada's economic future. We must also recognize the engagement of immigrants and their children in forging a place in Canadian society. Immigrants have revitalized urban spaces. They have worked in migrant industries and businesses, and they have also become citizens at incredibly high rates. Finally, Canadian support for diversity and multiculturalism goes hand in hand with the assumption that newcomers will integrate and blend into the Canadian society. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya, for bringing in that economic dimension of immigration, which is very important, especially when we are talking in the context of skilled workers and movement of people for work, which is the migration element, not the refugee element, right? And I think you brought up very clearly that labor market assimilation, that what you talked of, labor market assimilation, there is some problem there in terms of, in spite of all the policies that you're saying and the kind of goodwill that is there so far as the larger society is concerned for immigration, but there are certain problems so far as labor market assimilation is concerned. That's how you put it. And because you're also talking at the same time how immigrants are pushed into poverty. So
Right.
there are issues there, and that I think could also lead to gaps in social integration.
Right.
So it would be
Yeah.
perhaps interesting to discuss this at the end. The
Right.
next presentation is by just a minute. Yes, Shreya Sinha. She's a student at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her presentation, very interestingly titled as Kebab Anxieties, Understanding Islamophobia, Immigration, and the Failure of Multiculturalism in Europe Through Politics of Food. Over to you, Shreya, 10 minutes. So I understand Shreya is not there at the moment, so we moved on to the next presenter, which is Sri Lakshmi Mohanty. She's a research student at the Central University of Gujarat, and her presentation is on the Global Compact on Migration, a commitment for global migration governance cooperation. Over to you, Sri Lakshmi.
Madam Chair, we also do not have Sri Lakshmi Mohanji, Trivide Singh Maini, and Jiva Rai.
So are they likely to join in later?
We do not know as of now.
Okay, fine.
We have Dr. Ila Joshi.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me invite the next presenter, Dr. Ila Joshi. She's an assistant professor, MIT Law School, and her presentation is on rural migrant women and work, analysis of labor laws in China. Over to you, Dr. Joshi, 10 minutes, or you maybe have some more time because there are two presenters are not there.
Thank you, ma'am. My presentation is a bit different from the panel because mostly I'll be talking about the internal migration in China, but the questions of, as you said, othering and the question of identity remains the same. As far as China is concerned, the migration of people from rural to urban areas can mostly be traced to the 1970s when China actually opened up its economy to the world, and there was this, along the coastal areas, there was this boom of many multinational corporations, many big companies from Hong Kong, from US, they settled up their plants there, and hence there was a requirement of cheap labor. And the rural people, who had, just now they had witnessed this whole change in the land laws and created a surplus labor in villages. They actually moved towards cities, and from there we saw that how, there was this, one can say the largest migration of the time actually took place from the rural areas of China, from the western and the central areas of China towards the coastal regions. Now, the very interestingly, the thing is that, if we look at that generation of migrants who moved from rural to urban areas, they were mostly moving in search of jobs. They were looking for economic activities. But if we compare it to the generation of migrants now, which is relatively, you will find that at that point of time, earlier there was this migrant workers were mostly, they were very young, maybe, even 16 or 14 years of age. But now if we see now the migrant workers, they are, relatively, we find them mostly in the age group of 20 to 25, and sometimes, even 30. So there's a change in the age group of the migrant workers also, and even in the mentality, or one can say in Chinese as xiangfa of the migrant workers. That is earlier mostly, the people from rural areas, they were moving towards urban areas in search of economic opportunities, in search of work. But now if we look at the young migrant workers, the xiangfa is different in the sense that they are moving out of the villages to experience the world and to look for new opportunities, and also to see the urban way of life. But how far this migration has been easy, that's another question in Chinese context, because as far as migration in China is concerned, we have seen that migration there is mostly defined by a very important state institution, which is known as hukou, or household registration system. Under this system, the people, they are registered in their place of birth, and all their social benefits are actually tied to that place only. So in case if the people, they are moving from their rural places to the urban areas, we will see that their hukou is essentially rural hukou, which is not converted into urban hukou. And during their stay in the urban areas for jobs, they are unable to get access to all the social benefits, like medical care or education and other types of benefits, which are generally available to the urban place, to the urban people. These people, the migrant workers, in official parlance, they are known as Liutong Ranko, or the floating population, which again somewhere emphasizes on the fact that this population is floating, it is temporary, and is very, it's not permanent. So from one place to another, so there is another very negative impact of the parlance, the official parlance, which is used to address these people, the floating population, or the blind population also sometimes. They are known as. So this hukou, this whole idea of hukou has actually created, as Professor Ching Kwan Lee says, that it is a soft discrimination that has been created between the urban and the rural people. Now, in case of, not only this getting access to the social benefits, but also from the social perspective, especially in case of women, very young women, they are migrating from rural to urban places. And we see that mostly they are employed in manufacturing sectors in the special economic zones of China. They are employed in hospitality business. And we see that there are certain biases which are related to these women because of this institution of hukou. Since these women are migrant women in the imagination of the urban people, mostly they are seen as women who are very aspiring. They are looking for better lives, and hence when they arrive into cities, they are looking for better opportunities, not only in terms of jobs but also in terms of marriages. So these women, they are often, by the urban people, they are described as gold diggers, or women who are looking for men with urban hukous so as to get married. So there is this whole social narrative, very negative social narrative that is also created against these women. But then this whole issue of hukou, it actually gained gravity back in 2003, when it was seen that many young migrant workers, they in the cities of the coastal cities of China, they were working in these industries, but because of the lack of urban hukou, they had no access to the urban facilities. And also this, because of this discrimination that was created, they face many very difficult lives. In fact, in 2003, a very young migrant worker, he died in the police custody because he could not produce his temporary residence permit that was required in Guangdong province. Now that actually created this whole debate around the institution of hukou. And since then, we have seen that government time and again, they have been changing this. They are trying to reform this institution of hukou, but then how far these reforms have been able to address the problems of the migrant workers actually remains a big question. There was, for example, there are certain reforms. For example, in 1992, a reform that was introduced, a blue stamp hukou was introduced. Blue stamp hukou, basically, it said that the people, if the migrant workers, if they have a permanent work contract, or if they have the income tax documents of the last 3 years, or if they have education, higher education, then there were certain, these are the points they could get for these things, and ultimately they will be given the hukou of these cities, the urban hukou. But then as far as the migrant workers are concerned, if we look at the demographics, we'll find that most of these migrant workers, first of all, they are mostly, they have completed middle school. Secondly, when they enter into urban work industry, we find that they are working at very low wages because of their because they are low skilled, and hence in order to collect these type of points in order to get the urban hukou is again very difficult thing, especially in case of women. Women, as Professor Iva Wong very interestingly, she points out that in most of the East Asian countries, the poverty, it has forced many women, many girls to move out of their house and look for job opportunities, basically to support the sons or the brothers at home. So in that case also, I mean, if you look at the case of China, that quite fits there, and we see that most of the women, since they do not have high education, plus they are working in as cheap labor in most of these industries, it is very difficult for them to collect the points in order to convert their rural hukou into urban hukou. And secondly, when they ultimately, because of these circumstances, it's very difficult for them to contribute towards this whole the idea of migrant contributing towards the city, right? So that all these restrictions, actually there is a disconnect. The state has actually forwarded these reforms, but how far provinces have been able to implement this, that actually that disconnect still remains. And the Chinese state in the last few years, it has actually not decentralized its power, but definitely it has decentralized its responsibilities and given it to the provinces. Now when it comes to provinces, since provinces are left on their own to generate the funds and to manage their affairs, so the idea of migrant workers contributing to the economic, to the finances of the provinces, actually it becomes a very difficult question. Another thing that I would like to address too, as far as the problems of the internal migration in China is concerned, is about the social security laws that were basically social security law that was introduced in China in 2011. And this piece of law basically brought together two important legislations, that is labor law of 1994 and labor contract law of 2008. Basically these two pieces of legislations were put together as social security law, and under this law it was instituted by the government so as to prevent the migrant workers from falling into the trap of poverty, and to see to it that the employment that they are engaged in, that they receive the benefits from the side of the employers, and hence they there is a dignity in their work. And therefore the government assumed that doing so will actually integrate them into the urban society, will help the integration of the rural workers into the urban society. But then in fact, this particular law, it provided the employer, the employer and the employee to pay a part of these funds, whether it is insurance or whether it is the medical insurance of the employee. It required that the employer also paid a part of these insurances towards them. But then we saw that in most of the what is happening, that still the large number of women, they are not actually covered under this social security law or these particular schemes which actually address to the workplace injury, or the other medical expenses, or other for example the education of their children, or these type of schemes. The women workers have not been addressed in these laws, reason being that in most of the industries, even now in China, if we see apart from the industries which are the American industries, or the industries which are managed by the Hong Kong staff, we see that most of the other industries, especially those which are run by the Chinese administrative management, we see that most of the times that women they are since they are not involved into heavy work, that is management of the machineries or other such type of works, mostly women are employed into light works, like checking of the pieces, or keeping the pieces together. So these type of light works are assigned to them, and in such a situation, we see that most of the industries, they in most of the companies, the employers, they think that it is not necessary to they do not consider it necessary to employ the women or to bring them within the legal workforce by giving them by signing proper contracts with them, or giving them all the benefits. Now this type of thing actually, it again, there was this legislation by the Chinese government, the labor law, which actually addressed this type of problem where women were, all these problems of the women were addressed. But then we saw that most of the times, because of the, as I said, that the migrant workers, they are always on the move for a better employment. We saw that, most of the times women themselves, they were not very much ready to address these problems. They would think that it is better to look for another job rather than fighting with the employer for this type of problem. They would go for another job. And because of this, we see that most of the times these laws, in fact, they were not able to address the problems of the migrant workers in China, especially the women migrant workers. So that's what, like, I mean, if you look at the the labor contract law, or the labor law, or the social security law in China, or for that matter the hukou, the institution of hukou in China, we will find that, first of all, there is this disconnect between the state's vision of creating a harmonious society by integrating the migrant workers into the rural migrant workers into the urban place, into the urban, and there's a disconnect between the state's vision and the ground reality of the migrant workers. Also, there is a social marginalization which is not addressed by the legal moves. Now, when I say social marginalization, it mostly affects the women workers, the women migrant workers, because as I told you that, the narrative narrative of, for them being the gold diggers, or, women migrant workers being very sexually active. Hence, there have been sometimes there were the government's the government actually addressing to the high population rise of population amongst the migrant workers. It actually somewhere targets the women bodies, or the migrant women, the bodies of the rural migrant workers. So actually, so there is a social marginalization also, which is not actually addressed by these
Please, can you conclude now?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the last point is that when it comes to the imagination, the imagination of migrant workers in China, it's very homogeneous. That is, women as a separate category has not been addressed yet. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're very interesting. We can come to, at the end of the session, to many of the questions that you have raised, especially the gender aspect. I think that's the gap, gender gap, in terms of when you say that the women are not, their voice or their difficulties or their positions or what they're actually facing. There are laws, but they don't actually address that. So we can come back to that, all of this subsequently. The next presenter is, yeah. Minnati Kalo. She's an independent researcher at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her presentation is the Rohingya refugee crisis, a situational analysis of health status during COVID-19 pandemic in Bangladesh.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Himanshu Bhardwaj, again, research scholar from JNU, and he is going to present on internal security threats in India, consequences of illegal migration from Bangladesh. Over to you, Himanshu.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Is it okay I stop my video because there is a network problem here? Or
sure.
Shall I continue with video?
Either ways, we need to hear you, so that's more important.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Okay. So there are different approaches on migration, like migration as opportunities as well as challenges. But my approach towards migration as security threat to India. So as we know that South Asia, it shares a common culture history bonding with geographical proximity. So people cross border smoothly and their identification is also tough. But after the decolonization and arbitrary demarcation by the Western Europe, there is a theory of constitutional citizenship had been adopted. After the partition of British India in 1947, on the basis of two-nation theory, people migrated in their respective country where they wanted to. But due to cultural affinity and economic interdependency. People from erstwhile East Pakistan shifted to India. It created tensions between migrants and hosts. But Assam faced a lot of problems due to migration because it was the most sensitive area of Northeast at that time due to employment. There was an increasing amount of migration occurred during the liberation war of East Pakistan. To prevent the influx of people, an agreement was signed between Indira Gandhi and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in 1972 after the end of the war, which said that we decided a date 24 March 1971. People who came before this date were not Bangladeshi citizens and will be given Indian citizenship after 10 years. So my paper analyzed how the phenomena of migration poses a challenge to the territorial and demographic boundaries of nation state, and briefly discussed the dichotomous relationship between India and Bangladesh. This paper also explains the socio-politics dynamics of the eastern region of Indian subcontinent, their historical legacies, including border formations, examines how migration assumes a security dimension in the context of violence, induced displacement, and economic necessity, induced migration into India. The first of all, transnational migration is a threat to nation state. The migration of people across countries in search of better life opportunities and security is a constant process that has been ongoing since humans began building communities. But it was when the modern concept of the territorial nation state emerging after the Treaty of Westphalia that this phenomena became a problem to be dealt with and solved. The state aims to safeguard at one side the territorial sanctity and the other side demographic sanctity. National security is being increasingly defined according to non-traditional threats. Historically, the traditional threats are like external aggression or military warfare. But in migration, migration poses non-traditional security threats like social, cultural, environmental, demographic, ecological, and technology. Among them, migration, which is termed as monumental security threats for nation states. In the 1970s, the religious composition was also effectively changed due to migration of Muslims from Bangladesh, and it had changed the socio-cultural, economic, and political scenario of the state. Most recently, a political party named as All India United Democratic Front has listed itself the second largest party sorry, in legislative assembly with the grassroots level support of Bangladeshi migrants. A number of 27% of the total enclosed forest land in Assam was found to be in the hands of the Bangladesh migrants, and 43 out of the 126 assembly constituencies in Assam are their stronghold. These population movements have led to the high level of violence between migrants and residents in the area of migration destinations. The Balbir K. Pons said this infiltration as low-key Talibanization of Bangladesh due to increase of Islamic fundamentalism. Then reviewing the internal security threat, there are migration throws two types of challenges for a receiving state. First, the flow of people into another territory can threaten the political and cultural preeminence of the local population. Second, the presence of migrant exerts great pressure on the economic resources of the host country. But when to stop these migration, in 1951, the NRC was implemented in Assam, but there is a consistently migration occurs in Northeast India. But after the formation of Bangladesh, a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and peace was signed between India and Bangladesh. According to this, the countries would not allow its territory for committing any act that may become the reason of security threat of another country. The continuous migration in the following years made compulsory for illegal migrants determinations by Tribunal Act 1983 passed by Parliament to identify determination and deportation of illegal migrants from the state. Respectively, in 1985, Assam Accord was also signed. In subsequent years, a foreigners tribunal order of 2006 was released, which created undesired consequences that were further struck down by the Supreme Court of India. After the Supreme Court of India directive and orders of 2014 on the above matter, government has been decided to update the National Register of Citizens (NRC) in Assam. The whole process of NRC is consistently monitoring by the Supreme Court, and the central government is assisting the state government. So the first draft of NRC was first published on 31st of December 2017, and second was on 30th July 2018. The second draft has declared more than 28.9 million people out of Indian citizenship. But after the final publication, 1.9 million people left out from register. After the publication of the first draft on August 2019, interestingly, districts like Moregaon, Karimguri, Golpera, Barapeta, and Kuchbihar, which have always been seen as dominated by the illegal infiltrators and immigrants from Bangladesh, had relatively less number of non-included applicants. According to Mishra, the multi-ethnic composition of the society and to keep their identities safe has become the key issue that the state has to face. Indigenous Assamese have fear of losing their culture and identity due to slower growth of their population and the history of restraint they had for the time of 36 years. So the riots had been taken place between the above two communities in the years of 1948, 1950, 1960, 1978, 72, and 1980. Now, the macro-nationalistic approach had become narrow after independence, we can say, in terms of linguistic based to ethnic nationalism. That further became the reason of many killings in northeastern India. As Mandhar said, that the micro-nationalism of the 1960s, which was largely based on language, had been shifted to religion due to the influence of Hindutva politics by Bharatiya Janata Party in 1979. After the convergence of ethnic nationalism, more immigrants were targeted by indigenous people led by ASU. Many incidents occurred, including 1983's Neel massacre, which became the reason of 2,000 Bengali Muslims' death. In the following years, the agitation became more violent when it formed an extremist group named United Liberation Front of Assam. Hussain defines further that the Bodos fought against the Assamese, Lowland communities and Muslims in Bodoland and between 1993 and 1998. The violent activities increased in recent times, whether it was 2007 violence or 2014 when BBC reported the killing of 32 Muslim migrants and another 62 in the tribes community. As conclusion, movements from one place to another can be natural and human induced. It can be positive or negative also. It can be human induced, it can be by natural calamities. As Myron Wenner explained very well in his paper that natural calamities like environmental degradation, famines, floods, droughts, and human conflicts have become the reason to flee from one state to another. Migration can be accepted by government and citizens when migrants have the same culture, language, and religion, as well as it can be rejected for those who have different identities. Since migration is a social construct, so either it can be acceptable or threatened by host. In a broader view, it is a threat when it presents a political threat, cultural threat, socio-economic threat, and immigrants are used as a tool by political parties for spreading violences. Illegal infiltrators pose a major threat to internal security. This is leading to a social imbalance in many parts of the country, as well as putting whose pressure on limited livelihood opportunities. Therefore, the government has decided to implement the process of NRC on priority basis in areas affected by infiltrations because northeastern part of India is the most sensitive area and it is a dominant part of India's Act East policy. So it should be free from this type of violence activities. So the measures should be taken by both the governments, because migration at 80% of migration occurs from Bangladesh. So it can be created it can create tension between India and Bangladesh relation also. As a bilateral meeting by foreign ministers as Jaishankar, when as Jaishankar said, Bangladesh assured India that it will help future to implement NRC successfully. But what about the 1.9 million people who are now stateless? So they are facing the fear of citizenship crisis. So this should be resolved, and my study will examine this. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu. I think for bringing out many elements to the problem in the Northeast, especially what, as you termed this, as illegal immigrants. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that if you're looking at literature, and especially when you're looking at international law, there's this very clear understanding that that this is a kind of adjective which is used by the states, not just by India, but by also other states. But you also see that there is a very clear understanding that you can't really call people as illegal immigrants, and they should be referred to as irregular migrants or irregular movement of people. So we can come back again to all of this. I think the last presentation, because some of the presenters are not here, is by Minati. I hope she's here now, because I did see her in. Is she here?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes.
I'm audible?
Yeah. Okay, so
Just
you are audible. So I think you can just start now.
I don't know, something
your
happened. I
presentation
don't
is,
know. Now it's fine.
yeah,
Good
doesn't
afternoon,
matter.
all of you.
Now that you are here.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, and good afternoon to all of you. And today, my topic is it's all related to the refugees, and it's all about the Rohingya refugees and the health status of the Rohingya refugees during the COVID-19 pandemic. So when it's come to the health, so we all say this like that, the right to health is a fundamental human rights for all, including the migrants and refugees. So when it's come to the Rohingya refugees, so since the COVID-19 outbreak began, so the migrant and refugee population has faced numerous challenges, including loss of livelihoods, evictions, and stigmatizations. And Bangladesh and is a developing South country in South Asia with a high density of population. So the Rohingya refugee crisis is neither new nor a sudden problem for Bangladesh. So about 1 million of Rohingya have fled due to the ethnic cleansing in Myanmar and sought refuge in Bangladesh. So the refugees are basically located in temporary settlements on hilly areas of Cox's Bazar, and as countries closed their borders and asked their citizens to stay home to prevent this spread of coronavirus, and many aid organizations warned that the impact of the virus on the refugee camps in Bangladesh could be enormous. And suddenly it happens when the first case of COVID-19 emerged in Bangladesh in March 22. Concerns quickly followed about the potential for the virus to spread through the densely populated refugee settlements in the south of the country, and there are basically that are the home for over more than 8 lakh refugees. As per the recent data, it was more than 8 to 9 lakhs Rohingya refugees are staying there in different camps. So a rapid transmission of pandemic within the refugee camps would result in hundreds of deaths and quickly adjusted the limited capacity of the healthcare system within the camps. So as per the according to the WHO, World Health Organizations, as of 2nd August 2020, a total of 2,205 tests was conducted at the refugee camps, and out of these, 87 dwellers tested positive of them, and 7 have died. So this is all about like what kind of challenges the refugees are facing there in the camp itself during the COVID pandemic. So before talking about these challenges, like we just little bit talk about the geographical locations and what about these refugees actually. So everybody knows that among the world's most heavily persecuted minority communities are the Rohingyas people who fled from Myanmar and over the decades and currently live in Cox's Bazar physically. So Cox's Bazar is almost about one of the division. It's like 8 divisions, so one of the division of Bangladesh and a small town on the southeast coast. So in Bangladesh, around more than as for recent data, and more than 8 lakhs individuals. When it's come to in the year 2017, around 6 lakhs in 6 squads Rohingyas departed from Myanmar and joined the previously fled 2 lakh to 3 lakh Rohingya refugees, and making the total number it's more than a million. So around 65%, it's little bit the historical. So around 65% of them live in 34 extremely congested camps in 5 square miles in hilly areas of Kutupalong. It's in Cox's Bazar. So currently this is the Kutupalong. When it's come to Kutupalong, this is the world's largest and mostly densely populated refugee camp, and the living condition in the camps is woefully inadequate and unhealthy. So the average number of people per household is 4.5, and almost all of them live in small maxed shelters of 14 miles square. So sites built through the bamboo and trappines. So they have limited access to clean water over the muddy floor in their tents, and in this circumstances, maintaining even minimum hygiene is challenging, and any infectious diseases outbreak has the potential to kill thousands of people. So later when it's come to, as I told ki July August, when there are more than 2000 tests conducted in Rohingya camps, and 87 dwellers were tested positive. So when it's come to early 2020, before August, like coronavirus disease 2019 outbreak has substantially affected amongst all parts of the world, and including Bangladesh. So at the same time, for the first time in the month of May, one of the tests was conducted and 12,425 cases confirmed. And it was also documented in the government of Bangladesh documentary sites. So as the COVID-19 situation is evolving rapidly, the country is facing growing challenges to ensure preventive measures. So although no confirmed cases have been reported so far among the Rohingya refugees, recently the local transmission of COVID-19 in Bangladesh had challenged. So later, when he was talking about this COVID-19, so there are certain kind of, like, we have to maintain certain kind of rules. So like for example, when it's come to these cases in Asia, people across the world are like being advised to stay home, to practice and social distancing, to make hygiene a priority. So such actions are like next to impossible to practice in refugee camp, and such actions are for examples, like importantly, the Rohingyas refugees and the Bangladeshi local community are living side by side near to this camp. So with little or no restrictions for local people to enter the camps and for Rohingyas people to exit the camp. So although by the law they are not permitted to do so, so these refugee people are in a dire state of straits, and many of them has a range of underlying health conditions and nutritional deficiencies, and all these risk factors may suppress their immune system to fight against COVID-19. So as a result, the current community level transmission of COVID-19 puts them at risks of getting infected, and even if a single case of COVID-19 detected that time, so any intervention aiming to prevent further infections and manage the infected cases would be mission. We call it, like we gave it the title, it's like mission impossible, as the number, for example, as the number of cases may increase to thousands with a small period of time due to close proximity in the camps and high virulence of COVID-19. So with neither treatment nor a vaccine in near future, the effect might be devastating because of the multiple health challenges the Rohingya people already faced, including lack of healthcare facilities and services, existing higher prevalences of infectious diseases, and poor knowledge of health hygiene also. So there are so many things has developed during this time in this camp. So when it's come to the challenges, when it's come to the challenges, like what kind of challenges, what are the major concerns? So I'll discuss some few challenges. So when it's come to the challenges, the number one is like overcrowded. So when it's high vulnerability to COVID-19 transmissions, so Rohingya refugees have been living in extremely precarious conditions consisting of overcrowded, cramped and filmy shelters with up to 10 or more people per habitable space, making them then 8,60,000 Rohingya live in just 26 square kilometer of a land in Cox's Bazar, a population density that is 40,000 per kilometer. And each of them, this data is basically from this United, it's all mentioned in the government of Bangladesh, and United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees also. So each of them, less than 22 lakhs Rohingya families in the camps has an average of 4 to 6 members and are living in a small mixed shelters of 40 mile square size built through bamboo and tarpaulins, as I mentioned also. In addition, the majority of the Rohingyas, basically the majority of the Rohingyas families in the camps has an average of additional the other problems gets like proper education and limited knowledge about the symptoms and mode of transmission. Furthermore, so many preventive measures are also accepted. So, but when it's come to the overcrowded and when you have to give certain kind of information to the refugees, so because in the camp itself there are more than 4 languages, is speaking in the camp itself. One of this English also, Bangla, Rohingyas is also a language. So many people even doesn't know this Bangla language. It's a Bangladesh. So it's very difficult for them to communicate regarding the information of COVID-19. So secondly, the second challenge is insufficiency in basic services and health facilities. So Rohingya refugees are also suffering from a dearth of essential services such as food and basic health care, further aggravated by the restrictions extended to humanitarian workers for entering the refugee camps, and further their already dismal living conditions. So in addition to that, lack of access to potable water and sanitation facilities in the camps are another major concerns. So and basically because frequent hand washing and personal hygienic are prerequisite to remain safe from this COVID-19 transmissions, and although 13,500 hand washing stations have been created within the refugee camps to increase hand washing among the Rohingya refugees. And these are not adequate and most are not operational. This report was basically from this United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And in terms of emergency response to COVID-19, there is only a 5-bed isolation ward in Cox's Bazar district hospital and 250-bed isolation wards in Ramu and Chakaria Upazilla Health. It's in Cox's Bazar, Chakaria Upazilla Health complexes, and that had been set up for the entire Rohingya community as well as for the local Bangladeshi residents. So currently there is no specific and now it's basically like so many things it's happened because it's more than 1 year back it was like the situations like this. So they have faces certain many different challenges, despite that the United Nations agencies and other organizations are also trying to work along with the Bangladeshi government to increase the assistance response to the Rohingya refugees by providing human resources, equipment, supplies and consumables and technical operational experts. So many things has developed slowly. So this is the second this is one of the second challenges regarding health services and like lack of many things. So later widespread rumors when it's come to when I was talking about this rumors, so it's like it's leading the line. So Rohingyas communities are understandably apprehensive and further frightened by the widespread rumors related to the pandemic, which is negatively impacting the effectiveness of any COVID-19 response. So such rumors are basically obviously detrimental to the dissemination to accurate educational tools and aimed at self-protection to tackle rampant rumors and to reduce fear. So the Rohingya refugees have also been stripped of access to internet communications in September 2019, so which has further facilitated the spread of misinformation, deterred refugees from seeking urgent medical care, and hampered any potential efforts to effectively respond to the COVID-19 threat. So for example, if there is this widespread rumor among the refugees that if anyone has any coronavirus symptoms, so they will be taken and executed. So tens of thousands of Rohingyas woke up in the middle of the night suddenly to recite the Muslims' call to prayer after rumors and spread that it could be stopped for like prayer. When you're going for a prayer, it could be stopped the spread of the virus. So therefore, if the current misperceptions and opinion of the Rohingyas community is not addressed till now also. So potential efforts to control this outbreak will severely hindered. So later, when it's come to challenges, so always in any situation, there one challenge is always related to the women's, like violence against women's and girls. So the rise in the domestic violence and other form of violence against women and girls as a result of social tensions and escalating panic in the Rohingya camp is another key and thus far unaddressed concern. So global estimates show that in this crisis settings, more than 70% of women experience violence. So however, the COVID-19 pandemic situation has led to this increasing violence against women and girls, especially like intimate partner violence, like sexual exploitations and other form of abuse. Like, so the limited services that are available for Rohingya women and
Minati?
girls. Yes, ma'am.
Wind up now, right?
Yeah. Sure, ma'am. So now just it's all about like I just want to say this recent data and what are this major concerns by this different organizations. So just over a year later, out of almost 30,000 tests conducted in March 2021, tests conducted in the Rohingya camps, and only 400 cases of COVID-19 have been confirmed and resulting in 10 deaths. So the reason for the lower than expected numbers of recorded infections and deaths are not yet clear. But since the start of the pandemic, United Nations Human Rights Commissions for Refugees and the UN Refugee Agency and the other different kind of aid agencies have worked closely with the government and local authorities to come up with a response that includes both refugees and local Bangladeshi communities. So now, finally, I just want to say something. Recently, this certain kind of developments happen in this Rohingya refugee camps, because in the Cox Bazar, if you see this World Health Organization WHO recent data, so the scale of humanitarian crisis combined with the overburdened healthcare services during the COVID-19 pandemic compound the risks of poor health outcomes for the Rohingya refugee population. So this threatened to compromise important progresses achieved over the 4 years of the humanitarian response. So when it's come to like what are these achievements of this WHO, when it's come to this health services, so now basically according to the recent data, I'm talking about the recent data, July 2020, there are 175 functional healthcare facility in the refugee camps, offering a range of general healthcare services to nearly more than 884,000 Rohingya refugees and 472,000 Bangladeshi living in the surrounding areas. And this includes primary healthcare centers, health posts, and special fertility and field hospitals, and where major surgeries occur if needed. So additionally, as a part of the COVID-19 pandemic response, in March also 2020, at the time also WHO and partner established 40 severe acute respiratory infections isolation and treatment centers to provide quality clinical care to COVID-19 patients within this complex settings. So with a capacity of nearly 1,200 beds, so this healthcare facility can provide treatment for mild and moderate severe cases of COVID-19, ensure access to secure oxygen supply also for 24 hours per day. Thank you, ma'am. We'll discuss in the...
Yes. Thank you, Minati. There are a lot of issues which you have picked up, and I'm sure we can start the discussion because there's a lot of, ample time given the fact that some presenters are not here. So I'll open up the floor for discussion. If there are any questions on the presentations which have been made, you can please start your, putting up those questions either in the chat box or directly. So may I request anybody who has a question to come ahead and put forth the question? So I think I'll start the ball rolling since I don't see any question right now. So maybe we can, once I start presenting some questions and issues, we can then take off from there. I think we had very different range of issues which have been discussed in this session, beginning with Vijeta, who essentially talked about the politics of identity and then connected into diaspora and homeland politics. And with this case that she specifically looked at was the farmers' protest. And this actually opened up the questions on how diasporic identity, which develops over a period of time. I think one interesting point which you made, and which I think you were mentioning as some scholar has made, that as immigrant groups in these new environments or new societies which they go into, as they become more confident about their own identity, they start then from that point of or vantage of confidence to also connect with issues in the homeland or the countries of origin, and then pick up those issues because they're much more confident about their positions in various layers of society, be it social integration. So they're better socially integrated. They also have a political voice. They are actually citizens of these countries. So they feel in a position of power, in a sense, to actually comment on what is happening in the countries of origin, specifically dealing with their own communities. So here again, when we look at the farmers' protest, the idea would be that the connect is also because the farmers have a particular identity, which matches with the identity of the Sikh community. So it's a Sikh identity which is more important in terms of the connections. And the issues are also there, of course, the issues of the farmers, but the essential connecting point is the diasporic community's connection with the group in the homeland. So so therefore, it would be interesting to sort of think through this and see if when we talk about these connections, how these connections are identity, whether they are basically identity based or are issue based. So if you can just sort of highlight on that or elaborate on that, Vijayata, we can then take it from there. Or if there are any other questions for you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your comment and the question. So this whole issue about it, whether it is identity based or issue based, it's quite interesting because actually identity is the issue here, So the issue and identity cannot really be separated one from the other, because for the Sikhs, their very identity is agrarian. And like I had skipped one major part of my paper, the second part of it, where I had said that I am setting a context of how, how this entire thing about the Sikh identity, the evolution of it, and how various elements of it have manifested in the modern context here in this farmers protest. So one of the things, like their agrarian identity begins from the time Guru Nanak established his permanent residence in Kartarpur, where he started farming the land, and he gave the first three tenets of Sikhism, which is Kirat Karo, Naam Japo, Vand Chako, which means work hard, take the holy name, and share the bounty of your hard work. Okay, Vand Chako, and then you consume it, basically that. So the very first tenet that is given to their guru, given to the Sikhs by their guru, is about working the land, which was how it was earlier. And over the centuries, that has remained the mainstay of Sikh identity, Sikh people. And most of the people who are, most of the migrants who are there in the Western countries, they have very strong agrarian roots. They are primarily from farming families, and generally one of the reasons why so many Punjabis migrate is because of that typical issue. Firstly, of course, there are other linkages as well, but you know how it is, where the father has some land and then he has 3 sons, and then he has to divide the land between 3 sons, and then all those 3 have 2 sons each. So land holdings have become so small that some of the people needed to move out to sustain their livelihoods. That is still essentially one of the reasons why so many people from Punjab, because of their other network and linkages, they do migrate. In so many other parts of the country, people do not yet have that option because they don't have that kind of linkage, and then of course the aspirations. So with Punjab, their connection with the land has always been very intrinsic part of their identity. So I don't think we can really separate the issue from identity in this particular, for this particular community at least. And generally, like whatever the Punjabi issues, the Sikh issues are, I would say in some other issues, like for example, there are some issues that few groups raise, like separatist issues and all. In those issues, not all Sikhs are on the same page. There are many Sikh groups who are protesting against, I mean, even as that one big protest was going on about referendum 2020 in Trafalgar Square. I think it was in 2018 or 19. This New York-based group Sikhs for Justice had organized it in UK, Trafalgar Square. So there was a big group of Sikhs who was protesting against this protest because they said we do not subscribe to separatism. So then there are other issue-based things as well. But with this particular case, I think it is issue and identity. There's no boundary between it.
Yeah, I think I get your point, but I would still, I mean, just to take it forward a little and nudge you, since you're answering it well. So nudge you in the sense of, you know, when we're talking of the Sikh diaspora, you're also talking now when we're looking at, it's not just the older generation who had very strong connections maybe with the land, who moved in or to UK. You know, we're not really talking of that generation only. We are also talking of the second and the third generation who would not be aligned to this thing of the land that you say in the ways the first generation would be, right? So for them to connect, so it would be what kind of identity is that? That is something which would be interesting.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for raising this issue. When it comes to Sikhs, you know, one of the very pivotal Sikhs abroad, especially like the second, third, fourth generation Sikhs, like really young ones now in their teens even. So these people, for them, 1984 and the incident that, I mean, the issues that the diaspora faced during 1984 is like, it's a watershed moment for their self-identity, you know, because that was the time many Sikhs decided to start wearing the turban at that time. Whereas in India, there were Sikhs who were cutting their hair because they wanted to then, you know, not be identified as Sikh and face violence. That thing in the diaspora, from a distance, it manifested very differently because it kind of reinforced their identity so much into their very being that from now on, I'm going to be a good Sikh. That's the kind of sentiment that many Sikhs developed at that time. Young boys even who were like, you know, in school and all, before that they wouldn't, their parents would simply cut their hair for assimilation. But then from that moment on, they decided to take it on. And that moment is through storytelling, through personal experiences of people, it has really solidified in the conscience of the Sikh diaspora. Because what had happened at that time, ma'am, was that I have learned through, of course, literature as well as a lot of personal testimonials during my field work, that a lot of people who even went for protests in front of the embassy in London, they were put on the blacklist of traveling back to India for 30 years, 20 years. They were forbidden to come back to their land just because they protested against the violence that was taking place in India. So that kind of, you know, it's like in Hindi, there's a kahavat, right? Rahiman dhaga prem ka mat todo, chatkaye toote firte na jude gaant padi jaye. So in 1984, in that dhaga, a gaant has been made, you know, between the Sikh diaspora and the Indian state. And now that gaant is only going to remain unless some extraordinary effort is going to be made. But what happens, on the contrary, is that more and more issues take place whereby, you know, this gaant only becomes more and more tangled. That thing is getting more and more tangled. So that is why the younger generation is very much vocal about their identity and about their opposition to the actions of Indian state against whatever Sikh issues are going on. So that is my experience.
Interesting, and we can just carry it on, but I
Yeah.
think others need also
Yeah,
to come in,
thank
because
you.
just come one I think I'll leave you with one point, which is that the moment you say that ye jo aap bol rahe ho, gaant, the knots that you have tied, the distancing rather, right?
Yeah.
The knots signify distancing between the communities.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're saying that separatism is not high on the agenda of most of them. So it's interesting if you look at these two. There are knots.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
But you want to live with those knots. You really don't want to separate out. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you.
And any questions for her or any of the other presenters? I'm again requesting anybody who has a questions to come in. So I move to the third presentation, which was made by Dr. Joshi, which was basically on China and the rural and urban migration. Since we have time, we can sort of start a little bit more discussing this a little more in terms of the very interesting presentation that you made in terms of various laws which have been put in place on the one hand by the state. That was something which you talked of, labor laws and some social security laws which were passed. But essentially that did not address, if I understood you correctly, the gender issues, and they remain. And given the kind of setting that China is, the kind of political system that it is, what kind of alternative avenues are there by women to bring up these issues? One, you said, is they don't want to get into it, and then they move into different sectors and they just move away from that particular company or factory or wherever they're working, rather than take up these issues. But are there no organizations? Is there just a huge blank so far as activism or organization is concerned? You need to unmute yourself.
Am I audible now, ma'am? Okay. Okay, thank you for your question, ma'am. So, in fact, this alternative to the problems faced by migrant women is something that that is the thrust of my research also. That what are the alternative discourses? I mean, how these migrant women are faring in such a discriminatory environment. So, the thing is, like, I did some, like, for example, I did a field work in one of the northern provinces of China, in Shandong, in the city of Jinan. So there I came across like various migrant women from various walks of life. I mean, they were in different professions. So one interesting case that I would like to share with you is that of one woman named Fatima. She was from Muslim minority and community, and then she while I was staying in that university in the hostel campus, so she had a small food cart, and she used to prepare this food which was a fusion of Indian and Pakistani cuisines, and she would used to call it in Thai. I mean, in India Pakistan dish. So like, and she used to come to our campus, and she had made, like, because of her good nature, and she was bit more close to the Pakistani students, and in general to Indian students also. But then she created a very good rapport with these students. And over a period, and this was not new. I mean, we were there only for 2 years, but it had been there for very long. Even our seniors who had gone to that university remembered Fatima in that way only. And she was not only selling the food, but at the same time, she was also, whenever any student fell sick or anything, she would provide them, she would deliver the free food to that student. She would ask him or her that how is she. So she created a kind of rapport with those students. So now there was this time in 2015 when she fell sick, and her health issues. She was like very sick. I mean, there was some severe health issue with her. So in that case, because she was a migrant and she belonged to one of the the rural areas in Tacho in China, but she was actually staying in Jinan for last 10 years, but she had not converted her rural hukou into urban hukou. So she faced problems while accessing to the medical facilities in Jinan. So in that situation, I remember that all the students, especially the Pakistani students who were pursuing the medical courses, so they all came forward. They, in fact, not only from Jinan, but in different cities where, these students, the students from Pakistan were there, they all collected huge amounts of money, and they, kind of see through it that she gets best possible treatment. So that is one case where, and I asked her, in fact, once during, I was talking to her, I asked her that you have not converted your rural hookah into urban hookah, and you have been staying in Chinan for like last 10 years, but then your access to medical facilities. So she said, no, it's all manageable. I mean, we can manage. It's not a problem. I don't want to convert my hookah. I want to maybe go back to my native place later on, but I don't want to convert it. So the idea was that probably at that point of time, she had not faced such type of problem, like any health issue or something. But when these type of health issues came, like for this, her personal engagement or her personal rapport with the students and, her customers as such, a clients, the people who were buying food from her, it kind of helped. Other than that, I mean, and then in turn, I mean, there were many other Muslim women from her native town who actually used to come to Chinan. They were young girls and they used to work with Fatima, and sometimes they would even work in other places, and then they would stay with Fatima. So there was a kind of connect that was there. So Fatima, being the the older one, she had the experience of the city life. She would guide them, she would tell them how to do things. So it was a kind of a Quanshi, which is very important thing in when we talk about migration in China. Quanshi basically means connection. So that type of Quanshi also help these migrant women to actually to overcome the problems. Now, other than that, I mean, these are some of the examples, but in China also, I mean, we see that there are many NGOs who have been working for the cause of migrant women workers specifically. Now in China, as you said, that the political setting is totally different. The NGOs there, I mean, these are government NGOs, basically the NGOs which are registered with the government. So they're working in a way is, within the framework of the government. But there are certain NGOs, like specifically the NGOs from Hong Kong, which are kind of addressing the issues in a different way, outside the government narrative, and they have been quite successful in, for example, they are mostly these type of NGOs. They are working in the coastal cities of China where there are special economic zones, and the migrant workers are mostly concentrated there. So these NGOs mostly, they are working, for example, as far as women are concerned, there are certain NGOs which are specifically working towards educating them on legal issues, and in turn these women help the other migrant women workers to to know their rights and to know about the laws. So that is one collective, that NGO, the role of civil society is definitely there. Other than that, there's this very much internet has served the purpose very much, in the sense that internet is one, all these social media sites, especially in China, like if we talk about Weibo, or if we talk about Weixin, that is WeChat, all these social media sites that are there in China. So these sites, they kind of act as very places where these women are voicing they are voicing their concerns. They are very active on these social media sites, which is actually connecting them to the large number of people like them only. And that is how they are kind of building a collective, one can say a collective bargaining skill. It's kind of the process is taking place, and this is how they have been able to, in most of the times, because of the knowledge that they have, or since they have been educated by these NGOs about their rights, so they have been able to bargain with their employers, or they have been able to raise their voice against the if there's any discrimination against the women workers in these factories. So definitely all these things, they are there. So yeah.
From what you said, basically there are two things happening parallelly. One is the informal channel.
Yes.
The story of Fatima that you shared is basically informal networking, and then that comes to the assistance, which actually happens with women all across. It's not specific to China. So
yes,
women do network, and that's how they stand by each other. So that's something which does happen, especially in this part of the world,
yes,
developing countries.
yes,
Because the state there does not have the wherewithal, or it is not really in a sense completely committed to the questions of gender. It's an evolving kind of gender justice or gender mainstreaming that is happening. So there's a lot of things which is happening informally in terms of support systems being used or being built through networking. And also you said there's the civil society is also very much there, right? In the sense there is the civil society and the NGOs, be they still under the government, but still they're there in terms of at least educating women about their rights, because that's the first point. Unless you know what your rights are, you really can't fight for them. So both of these things are happening. That's what I understand from what you
Yes.
shared.
Also,
right?
ma'am, also this identity as a worker amongst the women. I mean, not just migrant workers, but the identity of as a worker has also become very strong.
Okay.
So that helps in connecting these women all across the country. And the identity of worker is somewhere very important why we are in manifesting their rights or demanding their rights. So that type of activism has only been possible because of this this whole identity, which has been further strengthened by all these different actions. So
Thank you. Thank you. I have, I have one question. I don't see anybody asking anything, so I'm just carrying on the conversation just to, make sense of all the presentations that have been there. I think Himanshu, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so your presentation, if I understood, was basically about securitization, right? How
Yes, ma'am.
migration is looked through the security prism, and you picked up the northeastern problem and what you termed as the infiltration problem, and how that's looked through the security lens, because that's how it is perceived. But when we talk about migration in general, right? And
Yeah.
what we also see, because when we talk about migration and migrants, in whether it is high skilled workers moving, mobility of high skilled workers, or whether we are talking about refugees moving, right? For instance, there was the paper which just was immediately after yours was Minati's, which was talking about the Rohingyas, right? So
Yes, ma'am.
on the one hand, it can be looked through the security prism, right?
Yes.
And that has been there is when we are looking at them. But there's also, when what she brings out is basically the human angle, right? The problem in terms of rights, when people are basically in dismal conditions, not looked after. So when we are talking about migration and refugees in general, what do you see a trend which is there across board in terms of securitization, or looking at migration through security lens, or is it something which is typical to some countries?
Can you please repeat the question?
What I'm asking is that you're talking about securitization, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And using this security lens to look at migration and refugees. So do you see this happening across board globally? Or do you see it happening in, for instance, a context which you picked up in the case of India or neighboring countries, where there is a kind of an immediate threat of many people, which is perceived as a threat of many people moving in?
Ma'am, basically,
because when we talk about, why I asked this is basically that when we are talking about, as I said, especially refugees, the idea is also about, there is this whole lens through which you can look at refugees, is the human rights angle, right?
yes, ma'am.
So but this is a different angle. So so what I'm saying is, do you see that this angle which you are taking as the security lens, right? Looking at it through security lens, is this something which is more like visible now across states?
Ma'am,
Or does the human right angle also exist?
Okay. Actually, ma'am, there are discourses between refugee and migrants.
I didn't get you.
Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
There are discourses between refugee and migrants.
Mm-hmm.
There are many of international conventions on refugee problem, but there are no international convention on migrant issues. And the second thing is that India allow refugee work permit, and why I called them illegal migrants, because of the implementation of NRC. And I'm not saying that they're officially illegal, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. But they are.
No, you don't have to apologize. I'm just asking you that,
okay,
how are you looking at this?
And you are saying that I'm seeing it as a security lens because the northeastern part of India is the most sensitive part of India in terms of multi-ethnic composition. That's why Indian Constitution provide this area a special provision by Article 371, by Schedule 6, by inner line permits.
Yeah.
So
Yes,
these
we know of that.
are for their cultural interest. They protect the economic and cultural interests of the region and protect the customary laws of this region. And migration from Bangladesh is basically in only in northeast part of India. So there is a clash between these identities on economic and political basis. There are some socio-political threats which I have mentioned in my paper. Like there is a political party. There is the 43 out of 26 constitutional legislative assemblies. Migrants have dominant effect. I can say they play a dominant role. That's
Okay.
why and the second thing is that after 2013, there is a rise in right-wing governments all over the world. Like when Donald Trump in America, he tried to make Mexico wall. In Germany, they are like they are maintaining distance, or we can say they are making laws regarding this issue. Brexit can be say the result of this issue also. Migrants are not the problem on economic basis because they can either be skilled or we used and the cost benefit analysis. But we also in the South Asia region, India is the also most populous country, and so providing opportunities to indigenous people, this is the first priority to India.
Okay. So we can also continue with this discussion, but we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Because there are many issues, when we talk about this, because if you continuously sort of sideline or ignore the human rights angle, you might actually create, if people are in conflict zones or being pushed away or marginalized, discriminated continuously, then they also have difficulties in associating with the place that they are in, right? So that can
Yes,
in itself become a problem in terms of security, because you're alienating a lot of people. But we can, as I said, maybe discuss it some other time in some other venue.
sure,
The
ma'am.
last,
Thank you.
thank you, Manshu. The last paper was of Minati's. Minati, if you're around, just a small point which I wanted to make regarding your presentation. One is that you talked about the COVID situation and how that affected the Rohingya population or the camps in which they were. But there are two, I think, issues perhaps which would bring it out more clearly. One is and which came out in your discussion when you are saying that in any case, even the pre-COVID situation was not great, right? So if the pre-COVID situation itself was not great in terms of, the health infrastructure or whatever kind of amenities that they had, obviously then that would get compounded once COVID started and it was affecting everybody across societies or countries, all groups. And there, so when you are making this kind of a presentation, it would also be interesting to see that other than the particular community that you are looking in at, which is the refugee population in these camps, what was happening to the larger population per se? What kind of amenities did they have? Because that would give you a sense of what, how different were the kind of provisions that were there for these for the refugees and the rest of the population. The gap is actually pre-existing from in the sense of that pre-COVID times itself there were problems. So just that kind that you need, perhaps you need to also bring that in terms of what was happening to, for instance, when you are talking of Cox's Bazar, what was happening to the surrounding areas where the refugees were not there, which means not the camps, but the others, what was happening to the others so far as COVID was concerned. So I think we are come to the end of this session. I don't see any questions or anybody with any comment. So I would just thank all the presenters for their presentations and thank the organizers for inviting me to chair this session. All the best for the next sessions. Thank you.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.